What were Jesus' last words? Go out into the whole world and make disciples. This Catholic podcast is all about helping you say yes to the final and greatest invitation of Jesus, the adventure you were made for.
Together, let's explore what business, education, organizational leadership, popes, saints, and scriptures say about fulfilling the Great Commission.
Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of the Being and Making Disciples podcast. We have our first guest interview. We're so excited to talk with Matt Regitz today. Matt. So Matt, I don't know what else to call you besides an evangelist. You do so many different things. I'm excited for folks to hear about it today, to know all that's going on in the Lord's vineyard of church ministry. A lot of dynamic things happening. So Matt, thanks for being with us this day.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It's an honor, even if it is before my first cup of coffee.
I have no doubt that won't dwindle your energy level. You're always a high energy guy, Matt. So maybe to kick us off, can you tell us about all the different things you're involved in and why they're each important to you in the area of evangelization and discipleship?
Well, yeah, maybe everybody ought to go get a cup of coffees because I might put them to sleep here quickly. Not because I have so much to talk about myself, but man, the Lord is just up to some great things in this season in the church. And I think at one glance, I'm like everybody else in the church. Like I've worked in the church now for 20 years, and I've worked around enough church folks to know that after 20 years in church ministry, some people get bitter, or they just kind of get stuck, or they get kind of locked in their ways, there's no fault of them really, other than just sometimes how the structure and the weight of it all just kind of wears people down. So with all that said, I'm at a place now in my ministry after 20 years of full-time church ministry at a mega parish in Houston, which I love dearly. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into the youth program. Along with my brother Dave, over a long process really of looking at what was working, what wasn't working. We were not happy with just staying put or doing things the old way. And just because it's the Catholic Church doesn't mean everything has to be done the same way for 2,000 years. The gospel's the thing that needs to be done for 2,000 years, not the methods. So we like to say, let's make the mission more important than the methods and not get locked into our methods. So I left full-time church ministry and went into full-time coaching ministry with a new ministry, a global ministry, new to me. Been around for about 5 years now. Father James Mallon started this ministry called Divine Renovation. It started with a book he wrote about he wanted church ministry to look different. And here's what he was trying to do. It was almost like his manifesto of like, see, it can be done differently, even when you're trying to combine three parishes, which this constriction of parishes seems to be a new model we're seeing across the country. So it started a ministry of how do we support other parishes in this effort of renewal. So I stepped out of that, stepped out of my old ministry life and into this joyfully. And it's just been great to see other parishes trying to do it differently, trying to not get stuck. And I coach these parishes. So it's like, how can we just tweak some things or help you get unstuck? Or how can we totally revamp some things? How can we give you a fresh vision? How can you raise up a leadership team? So that's kind of what my personal ministry is now. And I don't even know what that's going to look like because it was about a year ago that I made the change. And this whole year, of course, with COVID too, has not looked like I thought it would. And our ministry is evolving and scaling greatly. And it's just amazing to see how the Lord's blessing even us broken church folks that keep trying to swing away at it and see what happens.
Yeah, man, I would think that it's been a good time for Divine Renovation because COVID has kind of made it forced innovation for churches. A lot of churches were not live streaming services or masses. A lot of churches were not doing things online, and COVID made it happen. And that's been a really good thing. So I like to call it forced innovation, because if we had a say in it, we probably would have just kept doing what we were doing. People were showing up, but now folks may not come back, right? That's everyone's fear. So we got to do new and innovative things. So how have you seen the ministry you thought you were going to do with Divine Renovation change as you went into the year of COVID?
Yeah, well, one thing, I thought I'd be hopping on more airplanes and, visiting these parishes, because we know the value of relational ministry. Like we do that as youth ministers. That didn't go away because we administer to adults or especially to pastors. So, this relational ministry aspect that we're trying to have to capture now in a new environment. So, COVID wasn't the problem for ministry. It just shone a spotlight on all the problems we already had. I mean, maybe it accelerated some things like decline, especially now as you look and church numbers are showing anywhere from like 25 to 40% of the people, depending on what congregation you're in, returning in person. And for a sacramental church like we have, physicality matters, right? So it's not the end all be all. They have to be only at Mass. We have to find other creative ways to reach people, but it does not devalue our sacramental nature, of course. So I think that's part of it is how do we do a physical sacramental identity of church in a virtual world? So one thing I think the biggest pivot that I think we've made along with parishes has been this new identity of hybrid church. How can you live in both spaces? Before we used to say our parishioners were in our parish boundaries by zip code. What about our virtual congregation now? What about our virtual parishioners? Do they count even if they don't fall in my zip code area? That's a model of church, I think, that has and Pope Francis spoke about this in his newest document from the Congregation on the Clergy about those boundaries have shifted and they've changed. But we've been so used to saying, I go to this church because I live here. Now we have people that go to our church that don't even live anywhere near us.
I've played around with this idea a little bit, thinking about RCIA, and particularly if people wanted to become Catholic, but they didn't live near a parish that had an RCIA program that worked for them, or for whatever reason. So now all of a sudden, let's say you have someone from Colorado and North Dakota and Minnesota who's in your RCIA program in Texas. Where do they get confirmed? And do we have any problems with that? And to me, I think back to some of those early Christian controversies, and St. Paul was adamant, we are not followers of, Apollos or Paul or Peter. We're followers of Jesus Christ. And so my approach to that would be, let them come and don't hinder people from becoming Catholic. And if it doesn't fit with the old schema, so be it. Update the schema. Don't kick people out or turn people away.
Amen, brother. And, we have a working model of this already with regard to marriage ministry. I mean, think about couples that live far apart from each other. We've already made concessions in the church. So if you needed permission to make one more about, like, you're not making concessions about the truth, you're just making concessions about where they get formed, right? We can figure the other stuff out along the way.
Yeah,
right.
It's like the what is non-negotiable, the what we teach people. And like you said, man, I like what you said, that we're not diminishing the sacramentality of the church. The goal is to get them to Jesus Christ in the most holy Eucharist. That is always the goal. But COVID, people for legitimate reasons have had fear of coming, because of illness. The bishops have allowed for them to worship away from the altar, come back as soon as they are able.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't be afraid of that. We need to embrace it. So the what can never change, but the how needs to be negotiable, because the how is going to change by season. No one saw COVID coming. Okay. And if you got stuck in the old model, I think one thing I saw during COVID is the parishes that I kind of knew were already evangelizing, they kept doing it and they found new ways. It made kind of the cream rise to the top a little bit. And the ones that weren't willing to be innovative, they kind of suffered during the time of COVID. So don't put shackles on the Holy Spirit.
Mm. Yeah. And, my heart goes out to priests everywhere, leaders too, not just the priests, but their leadership teams. They didn't sign up they signed up for, of course, for this long term, but they didn't sign up for this specific season knowing what was going to happen. They didn't get into this because they were necessarily the perfect innovators and change agents. They did it because they loved Jesus and they wanted to bring sacraments to people. So this is really a place like for your ministry or for Divine Renovation, or even for what my wife and I do as a ministry, to step into some of those voids and walk alongside of them. They need help, right? They need help leading. Nobody's born a perfect leader, and they got this much training. Priest, that's a 0 if you're not watching, if you're listening. They got 0% training on leadership and best practice.
I saw 3. I saw 3.
That could be 3. So let's turn it. It's a 0 training in leadership and running a business. So now we're turning them into, multi-million-dollar CEOs, and they're like in the middle of a pandemic. No wonder they're struggling.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what I've noticed, because I thought about that a lot, is that some priests do like the administrative side. It's one of their giftings, but others say, hey, I just want to be a shepherd. And we need to embrace those priests and come around them and help them as the laity and work with their gifts and talents. Man, I know you were telling me the other day about a test that will, a little diagnostic test that can help a priest or any ministry leader know what type of leader they are. So I think recognizing those things about ourselves helps us know what people we need to put around us too.
Yeah, the test you're talking about is called the APEST test. And there's a bunch, right? Like you're going to have people listening. You're like, well, I know my Myers-Briggs and I know my DISC and I know, all the other indicators. The APEST test is kind of a ministry indicator, and it uses that Ephesians 4 reference from St. Paul, the fivefold ministries of apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. It's an acronym, so I just had to remember the letters in order. And what you notice is as you take these, your top one or two rise to the top. Well, pastors, if you look at like them as a whole, they're overrepresented by shepherd teachers. And so the evangelist apostles really need to come around these shepherd teachers, right? And push the envelope, because that's what a prophet does, and go out, because that's what an evangelist does. Shepherds tend to want to teach and take care of their flock, which is a great charism. They just need to bring others around them to help them in that capacity.
I love the distinction there in recognizing we've got manifold gifts, and it's not that any of us we only do some of these, but some of us are much more comfortable in one or two of those than others. And so Justin and I have talked a lot about maintenance versus mission. I am not a maintenance person. Like when a job turns into maintenance for me, I think this is so boring. I have to find something new to do. I have to innovate or just evolve the position, because otherwise I go out of my mind with boredom, because it's just not in my DNA to sit there and keep the thing running and make sure nothing goes wrong. I want to go beyond what we already have.
Yeah, I think none of us are meant to remain stagnant in our ministry. And I've heard our good friend in Orlando, Gail Dan, she talks about ministry is like an organism. It should evolve and grow over time, just like each of us. We kind of grow over time. So Matt, on that note, I want to ask you about two, I know you speak at Steubenville conferences. You present for different events, but I also want to ask you about two other ministries I know are near and dear to your heart. One is your recent book you wrote with your wife, I think, about your son wanting to become a priest, and also maybe the Survive and Thrive ministries. Could you tell us the story behind both of those and what they're intended to do to help people walking with our Lord?
Yeah, you bet. Survive and Thrive was really, it's funny. One is because of extreme, terrible grief, and one is because of extreme joy. And they're connected, which, again, we're back to the paradox of the cross, right? Like, you can't have the resurrection without the cross. I sure wish we could, but that's not the setup, and it's not our path either. Now, that's not to say that because of the extreme grief my wife and I went through 14 years ago, losing our 2-year-old daughter, that somehow God put us up to this or did this to us. That's not the case, but God was there with us in that moment. And that took some searching. My wife and I we lost a daughter. We put her to bed with a fever and a cough. And I know that sounds maybe more scary during this COVID pandemic, but that's what every good parent does with a sick 2-year-old with a fever and a cough. They put them to bed. My daughter just didn't wake up. And that changed, of course, our lives forever, but my dad's heart, it changed my faith. I had a lot of questions, of course, and that only God could answer. There wasn't a doctor or a babysitter or a drunk driver to blame. It was me and God, going fisticuffs over this, really wrestling with that. My wife and I realized, because of our grief and because we worked in ministry, that we're often invited into other people's stories of grief. How many, I can't count the number of times actually that we've been asked to accompany other people around the country, really, in their stories of losing their children. Because when someone finds out, that someone lost a child, a lot of times their friends or family members will reach out to us and say, hey, how do we walk with them? How do we help them? And that's really how the ministry started, was realizing this cross we carried of grief was really heavy. And crosses get lighter when you help people carry them. I mean, the whole image of, Jesus having his friend really at that moment carry his cross in the scriptures. So we started carrying other people's crosses, and we started a ministry called Survive and Thrive, realizing there's seasons in our life that are just about putting one foot in front of the other, that like getting up in the morning was a win today. And that needs to be okay. People have to journey through that. But too quickly, we like try and tell people, no, move on, get past that, get into thriving. Yes, thrival awaits us, but you do have to journey through survival. And so it's really to help people navigate that. And really, we want to walk with people that are helping others navigate that, because none of us were trained in grief counseling. I'm not a grief counselor by training. I've just had the school of hard knocks because of losing my daughter. So that's how Survive and Thrive started. And now we get to do marriage events and speak together, which is neat to have my wife speak with me, whether it's in a living room or on a stage, just getting to share our story with others. And then the book we wrote was about my wife, my son, Beckett, wanting to be a priest. And my wife wanted to help my son, like, let's go to the library and find a book on being a priest. Well, guess what? When you go to the public library and you go to the religion section or the children's section, there's no book on I want to be a priest. So my wife just said, okay, I'll write it. So she wrote a book about a little boy wanting to be a priest. Ironically, as you read the book now, it's actually autobiographical about my son and about my family. So we had to do some edits, of course. We got a really good friend of ours, Paul Latino, to do the illustrations. And we presented it to Paulus Press, a major Catholic publishing house. And they said, we love it. We were surprised. We were new at all of this. We are not book publishers. And now it's a thing. It's actually a book, and it's getting to bless other families. So something that started from just our desire turned into a fruit that's still blessing our family.
And what's the name of the book, Matt?
It's called Beckett Wants to Be a Priest.
Yeah. Where can folks find it? Amazon and probably Paulist.
They can find it both places. Yep, they can find it both places.
That is awesome, man. Yep. Speaking of joys of family life, you might hear a crying baby in the background. That explains I'm filming this in our office /class, and that's where I do our videos too, the messiness of family life. But Matt, I thank you and your wife so much for embracing what the Lord was calling you to do as you went through that process. I found it often, because I'd worked with a couple in North Carolina that they had lost their son, and he had died from a form of brain cancer. And it was a long, painful process. But what became their mission was helping other families that were dealing with that diagnosis, because traveling to different hospitals, finding lodging, paying for all that stuff is such a burden. They established this home. It's called Super Cooper's Little Red Wagon. It's a wonderful nonprofit, but they are people of faith. And it seems to me that when God might send us across, and oftentimes it's through the grief and the pain, something new is born that can be an instrument of healing for others. So how did you guys start to think and dream that, God might have, that we can find purpose in this? There's a way we can help others. When did it start to become apparent to you that you needed to start Survive and Thrive?
I will tell you, one of the biggest realizations that we had to wrestle with, did God do this to us? Father Mike Schmitz, got the #1 podcast of the country now, but he said to me at a conference one year, he said, God does not will our suffering, but his will is not thwarted by it. So really, there's a lot in that, but it's kind of like, you need to be sitting around with a beer or a cup of coffee, having a deep conversation about that. But like, God's not out looking for us to suffer and choosing our suffering. And none of us would wish it upon ourselves, or sometimes maybe our worst enemy, but we wouldn't wish it upon anybody we love. But if you remember Jesus in the garden, even asking God to let the cup pass him, like the desire to suffer is not there for us. And God's going to use it though. So I think it even makes God seem more powerful, right? More sovereign, more divine, that he can still use our suffering and it doesn't mess up his plan. He weaves it into the fabric without actually choosing our suffering. That's probably one of the chapters that needs to be in my new book about how to walk with people in grief, is a whole chapter on like what to say and not to say to people in grief. That's a big thing. Because not everything that's true is helpful. So when somebody comes up to me at the receiving line of my daughter's funeral and says, well, sorry, dude, God's will. Now, maybe we could have a theological debate about how this fits into God's will, but certainly not helpful, especially in that moment.
No.
So journeying with people is kind of an art. I like to use the story of Job where we don't get the answers to suffering in Job, right? People are like, oh, turn to Job, he'll tell you. No, it doesn't. God's more like, where were you, Job? Why are you asking me these questions? Excuse me. First cup of coffee hasn't gone down yet. So, but what I do learn from suffering in Job is 2 verses in chapter 2, 16 and 17. Job chapter 2, 16, 17. His friends show up. They sit down with him. They cry, they tear their garments, and they're present to him. And then for the next 36 chapters, they screw it up. They try and explain it all. They try and say all the right words until basically God and Job have had enough of his friends, and they cast them away. They get it right for 2 verses. They get it wrong for 36 chapters.
Well, I think on that note, you think about Christ on the cross, and who was perfectly there with him was his mother, who didn't try to fix things. She knew she couldn't fix things. She literally just sat there with her sorrowful heart united to him and wept and never left her son's side. So I think even Mary gives us the model, and I find it so
great, amazing
how no matter what loss anyone encounters in this life, God's been there. So for grieving parents, you can look right to our Lord's mother, right to God the Father himself, and see that, and see how God even and his people journeyed through that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had to come back to that, right? That was the realization. So then, to go from survive to thrive was realizing God didn't do this to us, and then saying, okay, where was God? And then finding that quest of how God was healing us and he was present with us. And that allowed us to wake up the next morning. And that allowed us to choose to go to mass the next time, maybe because we weren't like, oh, I can't wait to go to mass and have everybody surround me and cry on my shoulder again. No, like we had to start choosing some of these things very intentionally. And that's where we started saying, we're going to live life on purpose. We're going to live life on purpose and with a purpose. And that's where Survive and Thrive started.
Wow, Matt. Well, so many different directions I want to take our conversation with things you said. Maybe just a simple question. Maybe you could just share, when you think of some of your favorite experiences in ministry, all the different things you've been a part of, youth ministry, seeing kids you had worked with years ago, now serving as priests in the church. You think about your work in Divine Renovation, helping parishes and dioceses be more effective in their mission, helping them tweak what they're doing, Survive and Thrive, the book. What experience maybe stands out as something that, wow, this is something I could only have experienced by serving in the vineyard of the Lord. This is just incredible.
Mm. Well, I do think one of them is doing things like this, like getting to share my story and do ministry with other people out there doing creative things, like you two. And I told you, Justin, we had a talk like over the holidays. I was in Colorado, and we had a talk, and the thing that stuck out for me about your ministry was the title of being and making disciples. And how many times I've said it's, that we're not just about being disciples, because I think somehow in the church we got the message that we just need to be disciples, but it's about making disciples. And that's where a lot of Catholics are not comfortable. Like, no, I'm okay with my own personal holiness. I'm going to sit in this pew. I paid for this pew. I go to confession. I'm being a disciple. Yeah, leave me alone. I'm being a disciple. And I've made the distinction like, no, it's making disciples. And you guys have so naturally captured that tension, which is being and making. Like they should go together. And if they don't, you're either not being a disciple in the first place, or you don't know what a disciple is. So we need to help people on that. So doing stuff like this gives me a whole lot of life. And it all started with just, people come up to me like after an event and say, how do you get to speak, or how do you get to share your story? I said, share it with the people around you, share it in your circle, share it with your family, with your friends, organically.
Just get started. Just do something. That's literally it. Is just wherever God has placed you. And you're right. Your first audience might be your family or your neighbors.
It has to be. That's our domestic church.
The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, but then it grows and grows. So just start laboring in the little vineyard He's placed in front of you.
And I love figuring that out. That's, I think, one of the joys of ministry for me is I couldn't have predicted, that 1 Corinthians 2:9, what eye has not seen and ear has not heard, nor has a human heart even comprehended what God has ready for those who love him. I couldn't have predicted any of this going into youth ministry. I was an oil field salesman, for crying out loud, going to work for a global company like Divine Renovation. I was a youth minister, for crying out loud. Talking to you guys in the morning. I haven't had a first cup of coffee, for crying out loud. So all the surprises God's put in my life.
That's the biggest mystery of all. Right?
That is. I love all of that. And I would say probably one of the other joys has been seeing the fruits. And I know a lot of people in ministry don't see the fruits, right? Because we're planting seeds. But when you get to see the fruit, that's when you are reminded of, oh my gosh, God actually used me. And it made a difference and the kingdom grew. And, to see, like when I was in youth ministry, we had 30 young men and women enter religious formation or seminary formation. 30 in my 20 years that I was there. Not all because of me, but there was this culture of vocation that was being fostered through families. And now to see these families were starting to gather. We're starting more domestic church ministry now, even with Survive and Thrive. Like, how do we gather with other like-minded families? How do we create a rule of life and a rhythm? How do we gather with intention? The church is probably going to get smaller, and the church can't be dependent on what happens at the parish. And it never was supposed to, but I think we somehow got stuck in that cycle.
Oh man, we're probably going to have you back to talk about that, because that's a whole topic in itself. I mean, the renewing the domestic church is one of the things I'm most passionate about. And when I look back and think about the moments and the people that contributed to me loving God, they happened in people's homes, and it was because people of faith opened their home to me and to my family, and there was authentic community there, and I was people witnessed to me unintentionally, or maybe they realized it at the time, but it certainly didn't feel like a lecture. Nobody was teaching me; they were witnessing to me, and because they were witnessing, I was listening. And as you said, like I want everybody to go to the parish and go more often. But let's say they go 3 times a week. That's a lot. That would be a very active parishioner, and maybe they're there for a total of like 6 hours. There's a whole lot more time in the week where we have to spend being Catholic. And most of that's going to be in our homes and in our workplaces. So if our homes do not become little evangelical outposts of the parish, then we're losing an opportunity.
I love that, Dan. We need to sit down again. I want to hear your side of that as well. That would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to share. And I'll go back. I didn't want to interrupt Justin earlier, but I just want to say thanks so much for sharing your story. And I mean, it just it renews my faith to hear that you were able to walk through so much suffering with your wife and still come out loving God and recognizing his love, and not being trapped in the lie of thinking, oh, God did this to me, I'm so angry at him, which it's understandable to see how people get there. But then even more to help people out of that so that they can continue to thrive after that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was Bishop Robert Barron that said, God hates death and wants nothing to do with it. And if you think about the biggest miracle the world has ever known, it was defeating death.
Wow. That's, that's almost like a hard thing for me there's something inside me that almost initially rejects that and rebels against it. It's like, well, is that true? Is that really? And
yeah,
but you're right. I mean, the resurrection is God's de facto rejection of death for his beloved creatures.
And it doesn't mean we're not going to have to walk it, but we're back to the paradox of the cross again, right? Like, you can't have the resurrection without the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Wow. Amen. Hey, Dan, no apologies needed. Okay. As soon as Matt started talking about family life and domestic church, I was like, here. Dan, I saw that on mute. I was like, here we go, baby. But yeah, you guys need to talk, because that is what Dan is all about, and it's beautiful, and you both are right. So Matt, I think the reason our Lord has used you so much is you've focused on what he's been asking you to do, right? And sometimes we get overwhelmed with all the problems that we might think there are everywhere in the church, in the world, or in society. And Mother Teresa, though, we need to look to the saints, and I've been reading again about her life, because every time I need a reminder of that humility, that importance for that, God brings me a book by her or something. I mean, she's just one of my favorites. And she said that Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, said that we need to be like tiny little pencils in God's hand. We need to focus on where He has called us. We need to just let Him use us, let Him use us as He sees fit, and He will use that pencil to draw a masterpiece with our lives. Matt, I want to ask you just one final question before we wrap up here: is what would you tell someone who is in ministry right now who might be a little discouraged or stuck?
I don't know anyone like that, so I'm not sure what I would say. I'm sorry, joking, of course. Gosh, it is such a tough season, and I think discouragement is also part of the story, right? I mean, the apostles got discouraged trying to figure this whole thing out in the early church too, and I feel like we're back to like pre-Christian territory here. And the church, again, we're gonna have to like rebuild it, do some Pope Francis work here. That I think discouragement's part of it. It's how do we deal with that? How do we manage discouragement? Where do we go with it? A few things I would say, of course, this is a double down on your prayer life. New Year's resolutions, that not just to do that. This isn't about self-help, but renewing our commitment to the Lord, our personal commitment to the Lord. Is one. The other is to have a guide or a mentor or a spiritual director or someone that you can meet with regularly, and it needs to be planned regularly. I think it's not just, as I need it, right? It needs to be like once a month or whatever the cadence is. Someone that you can speak to, share vulnerably, and they can share authentically back with you. Doesn't mean it has to be I'm not saying like a good friend. You need one of those too. But I'm looking for like a guide, someone that's a step ahead of, that can speak wisdom into you. So I think that helps in discouragement as well. The other is choices, right? Like we need to just make the choices when we don't feel like it. Now, when you're in the church, right? Like we do a lot of things we don't like. I still have to do administration. It doesn't mean because I don't like it, I don't do it, or that doesn't get me discouraged. But we need to make choices. And not to lose sight of the fact that this isn't just an emotional ascent. We're not just doing the things we feel good about. So renewal of your personal commitment with the Lord, a guide, make some choices, and then finally have a vision. And this is not the like final thing, but it's the thing that I think keeps us propelled forward, which is a vision, which is a picture of the future that we can get passionate about. And a lot of times that is around what's not working in my life right now and what I want to work. So those two things, like healthy discontent and a desire for more, will drive you to live out your vision.
Well, thank you, Matt, for those wise words. Yeah, folks, it's amazing how often it comes back to our habits, how strong are our habits, and that's going to dictate our life. So with Dan, I just thank you so much for making the time for us, sharing your story. Folks, if you like this episode, please like, comment, subscribe, share this with other people that need encouragement right now. Know that the church is busy and active. Do not be discouraged. We're a lot of people in here. Connect with us. Keep hearing about things other people are doing. Get ideas, read from our book, some of those concepts that will help you get going. Go make disciples. And Matt, what are some of the ways they can connect with all the things you just mentioned that you're doing?
Yeah, just quickly, they can log on to the interweb and search up divinerenovation.org. That'll tell all about our global ministry of helping parishes to become missional, especially in this environment. You can find my wife and I, Survive and Thrive, both on Instagram and the Facebook. And of course, if they want to check out that little children's book, or there's a little boy in your house or next door or a grandkid that you want to read a whimsical story about a little boy's desire to be a priest, they can find that on Amazon.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. There's a quote that you just said that's echoing my ears. Discouragement is also part of the story. And that one hit me pretty hard in a good way. And I wrote that down actually as we were going here. So I'm going to go back and think about that. Because if I think of my favorite saints, discouragement is part of their story too. And it's not made up. It's not just all rainbows and unicorns and that kind of stuff. So thanks so much again for being with us, and really look forward to the next time, and we can dive more into the domestic church renewal.
Already planning it. Can't wait, guys. Thanks for having me. It was an honor, and look forward to when the world opens back up, hanging out with you guys too.
That would be awesome. Well, God bless you, brother. Thanks so much.
Thanks. God bless. Bye-bye.